Comics have now been on the Veve app since August, and although some people are focusing more so on the collectibles, I think it's important to look at the comics as a whole and see if they're actually something we should be paying attention to. So in this video, we're going to be looking at comics, figuring out the popularity in the physical world, which could lead onto the digital world, and maybe some of the comics that can give you the best returns if you play your cards right. So let's get started. Welcome in everyone, my name is Andy and I appreciate you taking some time out of your day to come and watch this video on the channel. Just before we get going, if you are enjoying the content and you want to support me further, you can hit that subscribe button, and if you want to support me even further than that, you can join the membership. It was really interesting to see how comic books were reacted to when they first came on Veve. Some of you who are coming on now might not truly understand the prices that these were at, but Marvel's Comic 1 used to sit at around 4 gems on the marketplace. I actually gave out, I think, 8 Marvel Comic 1 comics to people who downloaded the Veve app and started their new account when I done it on Twitter, and now that was worth 400 and it is high. I think it was up at about 800 gems when it came to it. So having something that really was slept on in the beginning, people didn't really understand their value or if they were going to hold any value because the edition sizes were insane at the time, is just incredible to see the shift and how people really started to pay attention to what the comics were and why. I think people started to realize that comic books in general had more data than maybe the physical collectibles with the NFT format we were getting. You know, Todd McFarlane is an incredible artist, and now I know all about him. I have the actual statue behind me now because of the NFT version. But with comic books, it's a little bit different. I feel the popularity is more on a grand scale. We have more comparable data when it comes to the prices, the editions that were given out, and more. Those were released in certain eras, like the Silver Age, Golden Age, and more, are probably easier to actually establish than the physical collectibles. So with all this, the prices of comic books started to become more realistic for what they maybe should be at. Fantastic Four 1, Amazing Spider-Man 1, Marvel Comics 1, and some others certainly started to rise in price as people began to get into them and saw that this was an easier way in. The comic books as well was a great insight to people who were coming into Veve because they were cheap not only to get into the drop system, but also because this was something they had maybe recognized from the physical world with what they were buying. In North America alone, they've been able to maintain a $1 billion business within the comic book region, and this doesn't really seem like it's going to be slowing down. Actually, in a 360 research report, the global comic book industry is expected to reach $4.69 billion in 2026, up from 3.87 billion in 2020 for a compound annual growth of 3.3%. Now with this and showing that comic books are becoming more popular and it is easily a $1 billion business, there is a lot of comic book fans out there who are maybe looking for something different or to get their hands on what's classed as grails in the physical world. It's not to say that they're going to be the exact same prices as those, but it can definitely show that true comic book collectors, as they maybe get more excited about this Web3 crypto NFT world, they might actually want to be buying into the things that they can't get their hands on in the physical world. Comicron is one of the leading comic book sort of sales trackers when it comes to what is actually happening in the physical world, and it found that in the summer of 2021, comic book sales were actually at their highest point in the last 25 years. And the other two higher points was when there was double the amount of comic book stores there were back in 1997, and in 2016 DC had a sort of rebirth which initiated a new sort of launch when it comes to DC and why sales were so high. So at this time there weren't really any significant jumps or shifts or changes happening, but comic book sales were an all-time high, and this most likely will be increasing in the digital region as well, as now someone like myself who never has read a comic book in their life has now read comic books on Veve, and I'm now actually excited to collect comic books that I really enjoy from the characters that I like the most. From the Comicron sales data as well, we've actually found that digital comics have been steadily increasing since 2015 in the amount of revenue that it's bringing in. So in 2020 we found that graphic novels were around 835 million, comic books themselves were 285 million, and comic books when the digital format were up at 160 million, which has been steadily increasing since 2015. And this really does go to show that comic books are now becoming more sought after in the digital realm, and as we move to a more digital world itself, it just makes sense that people are going to want to have access to some of the best comic books from the silver, gold, and other eras that they may not have access to now. If we look at Marvel Comic 1, the actual physical version, it's unlikely that the average investor is ever going to be able to afford one, as a record sale of 1.26 million and continues to be a very sought after comic book, with I think only around 60 odd that are actually CGC rated that are in circulation right now. It's clear to see that most people are never going to be able to get their hands on that. However, with the release on Veve, now 30,000 people are going to be able to get hands on the original comic cover with the common for only 400 gems or $400. You may also be thinking with that, if you're someone who's not invested into this, $400 is still a very steep price to pay. But for me, when you compare something like the physical comic book to something that is so sought after with the first ever Marvel's comic book for only $400 and something that you now own, can read at your will, sell on the market and do with whatever you really want with it, then that to me is actually quite a good deal. The digital world, however, is bringing in this new phase of digital prices. There's a lot of people who complain that we shouldn't be comparing the physical copy in the real world to the digital copy in the Veve space, purely because this is a new space. It isn't the same as the physical world, and therefore we have to establish what the digital world will actually see this price play at over the long run. For me personally, however, I still think it's very important to compare the demand of the comic books themselves rather than just the significance of the comic book. So investing in these to me is actually quite important to do, and why I've started to diversify more into comic books. But I still think it's important to choose the right ones, and why. You have to, just like the physical world with collecting anything, you have to pick the right ones for certain reasons. If you're collecting something like Plant Man for the first ever comic book of him, and even if it's very scarce, it might not stand the same test of time of something like the Amazing Spider-Man. By the way, yes, Plant Man is a real character. You can see it on the screen right now. Yeah, if they actually do ever release a comic book for him, I'm buying it just because I've said it in this video. The point is, you've got to see where the demand is for characters and the way the community feel behind it. Some incredible insights from Comics and Crypto and Sleeping Comics, who talk about comic books on their YouTube channels and just in general when I have a lot of conversations with them. They're very knowledgeable on the physical comic books, but that doesn't mean that's going to be the same when it comes to Veve. We saw something like the Amazing Spider-Man that was released with only 1,000 editions still have a lot of demand and be significantly higher than some of the others, purely due to scarcity alone. Now, this could play a part in the future and why we actually have to look at demand for certain things and reasons behind that demand as we move forward in this space and become decades in. For the future as well, we have to look at things like Veve's own personal cover or artists actually doing the covers themselves. Veve have created some of their own art, the likes of the ultra rares when it comes to these comic books, and that could have its own digital market, as well as some other individual artists who are creating some of the covers, such as Strange Academy. You can also look at some of the comic books that were worked on, the highest regards of the best people in the world when it comes to people like Stan Lee. So this again can add to the influence that people want to purchase for these comics, and why prices can certainly drive up, and why I actually believe you really should be paying attention to them and understanding the comics a little bit more than you may be at the moment if your sole focus is the collectibles. To come to a sort of conclusion on this point in general, comic books are $1 billion business, meaning there's a lot of comic book fans out there, and although there's a lot less comic book stores than there were, that should indicate that comic books are moving to the digital realm. Yes, I understand that people do like the grading of the comic books themselves in the physical format. You can feel them, touch them, you can have them on your wall, whatever. But in the future, if we're really thinking ahead, where we're looking at things like the metaverse going to be a part of our lives, we're going to have places where we can actually use those senses to have these comic books in our possession. And having the licensed ones of these, of the best comic books in the world that are sold for hundreds of thousands of dollars for only a couple hundred gems, that is a risk of investment that I'm actually willing to take. This is not to say at all that these couldn't go to zero tomorrow. Again, I say this in a lot of videos, but NFTs are the most speculative investment that you could make and could potentially go to zero. A lot of people right now are still terrified of what this Web3 region can offer and are completely against it due to their own personal reasons or whatever is actually coming their way. I don't doubt for a second that some of these reasons are valid. This growth may take longer than people actually expect, but if we're looking at stock investments or property investments, decades aren't actually that long when it comes to these investments themselves. And why I've always been focused on playing the long game with this rather than some sort of short form quick money grab that doesn't actually benefit anyone, only the people at the top. The prices of comics in the beginning are what most people can afford. So that is what they get into originally. If you come into this space for the first time and you want a Batman, you're having to pay minimum a couple hundred gems. But when you come to a comic, sometimes you can get them from between 10 and 50 and they're actually quite demanding. This allows you to get involved in something that could genuinely bring you a good return on investment, have something that actually means something to you, and maybe is out of your reach in the physical world when it comes to the price of what they actually are offered. And why I believe you should be paying more attention to what comics are as a whole, understand them a little bit more, and learn from some of the the experts in this field who have been collecting their whole life and actually understand comic books in general. For me, my collection is round about an 80-20 split when it comes to collectibles with comics right now, but I do want to increase that. And I've been mass buying some of the comics that I truly feel will be better over the long run as they play out and more people are getting into this space, as we're continuing to see a rising increase in users with 1.9 million active users on Veve at the time of recording this video. But what's your thoughts on the comic books themselves? Is it something that you collect often, or are you not really bothered by them, and do you feel we have to wait to see how this digital era plans out? I'd love for you to let me know down below. I know the video on the screen right now will be something you'll love to watch. Have a fantastic day.